Is too much reading a waste of time? Cervantes would have thought so. He wrote a novel about a man who read so many fantasy novels that he went insane and started attacking windmills. Jane Austen would probably agree. She wrote a novel, Northanger Abbey, about a young woman who read so many horror novels that she lost touch with reality. There is an anti-reading strain in Western literature, and arguably it begins with Plato. Plato would have thought that reading imaginative literature was a waste of time. His student, Aristotle, however, would have disagreed with his mentor. Aristotle took our imaginations very seriously. He thought our capacity to imagine unreal things was a key part of our human nature. Aristotle took imaginative literature very seriously. His work, The Poetics, is probably one of the first works to rigorously analyze literature. Aristotle thought that really, really sad stories were both psychologically and socially beneficial. Aristotle thought that watching fictional tragedies allowed us to purge real negative emotions. Aristotle also wrote about comedy. But his treatise on comedy did not survive the medieval and modern worlds. We don't have that treatise. But we can speculate about what Aristotle would have said about comedy. Formally, comedies are stories where things work out okay. One of the most useful illustrations to illustrate this difference is the work of Dante Alighieri, specifically his Divine Comedy, which is a comedy about going to hell. Right? It's not very, laughter-inducing, but it ends well. This is the highest and the holiest. It's my favorite illustration of Dante's work by Gustave Doré. For me, it is a compelling visual allegory for the longing for the unreal that animates so much literary art. Dante Alighieri's 13th century was not a great time. There was plague, there was war, there was political turmoil. But using the allegorical, the unreal, the fictional, Dante was able to transcend that horrible moment. Let's talk about another very difficult time. 1932. 1932 was a horrible, horrible year. And just to give you a sense of all of the things that were going wrong, let me just list a few. There was a national treasure, Charles Lindbergh Jr., a baby, in all the newspapers, kidnapped and murdered. Homeless camps or Hoovervilles were sprouting up everywhere. In Washington, D.C., there's a thing called the Bonus Army, a group of World War I veterans who were squatting and demanding economic relief. The Dow Jones reached its lowest recorded level in the Depression years. And in June of 1932, the Nazis became the majority party in the Reichstag, cementing the fate of the Weimar Republic. And we know how that turned out. Things were going to get much worse. The Holocaust, Hiroshima, just a horrible year. But 1932 was also a watershed year in American fantasy literature. Let me introduce you to a fantasist I study who was working in 1932. Robert E. Howard. This house is now a museum in his hometown of Cross Plains. So Robert E. Howard was born in he lived in the 1930s in Cross Plains, Texas. Cross Plains had been an oil boom town, which was not what you would call a vacation destination. There was a pharmacy, a grocery store, some offices and warehouses. There was an ice house where they had illegal prize fights. Howard actually participated in some of those, or he said he participated in some of those. It wasn't the best place, the most culturally, enlightened place, if you will. With all apologies to people who live in Cross Plains today, they're wonderful people. I've been there. Howard's family, they lived in town, not out in the country, but Howard always felt like an outsider in Cross Plains. Why? Because he wanted to be a writer. That's an interesting career vocation for somebody from an oil boom town. Howard's education as a writer was somewhat self-directed. His education consisted of the books that he could scrounge. He would go on road trips to find books, the magazines that he would buy from the pharmacy, and a voluminous and actually very sophisticated correspondence with other pulp writers. He had some formal education. He went to high school. He had some trade school education. But for the most part, as a writer, he was an autodidact. Howard isn't what we would call a respectable writer. The magazines that he published in were very cheap. They were printed on newsprint that decayed very quickly. They had garish covers, sensationalistic covers, but they were exciting and immensely popular. The pulp magazines. The pulp magazines are very influential on American popular culture. So many of the escapist genres that we love today were developed in those pages. Adventure, Western, the pulp heroes. You've heard of The Shadow, right? The Shadow knows, right? I don't know if you know. Okay, wrong audience. Those pulp heroes became our superheroes. You can't have the Marvel universe without pulp magazines. In 1932, Robert E. Howard created Conan the Cimmerian, more popularly known as Conan the Barbarian. His stories featured supernatural protagonists, powerful protagonists facing off against supernatural menaces. There was adventure, horror, beauty, terror, you name it, truly escapist literature. There are two main schools of escapist fantasy that I'm not sure if you're familiar with, but you're probably familiar with one, the British school of escapist fantasy, epic fantasy, associated with J.R.R. Tolkien. The other one being sword and sorcery, associated with Robert E. Howard. Is it any coincidence that this major school of escapist fantasy was developed in this horrible, horrible year? And what do we think about that? Do we see Robert E. Howard as an irresponsible dreamer who withdrew from the world, both literally and figuratively? He actually took his own life just a few years after he created Conan. Or is there a more compassionate perspective to consider? Is the most imaginative of literature, the literature that literally leaves the world behind, worth our time? This is an important question for me as an English professor. Is it the job of the artist to propel their readers toward the real world, right? Or is it also part of the job of the reader to help inoculate us from the world when it's very terrible? I'm not going to pretend like I have the right or the correct answer. I'm still working this out. But I've articulated the question, which I think is half the battle. Is it the job of the writer? Is it the only job of the writer to reveal the tragic nature of the world, the way we are the victims of the capricious gods? Or can it also be the job of the writer to teach us to hope, to maybe leave the world for a little bit, if only for a little while? Thank you.